My name is Natalie Reider, and I'm here today to talk about open source. So, during the presentation today, I will be discussing all the pertinent topics I believe essential to becoming familiar with the concept of open source. First, we will define what open source actually is, share a bit of its history, share some terms that are pertinent to understanding the open source conversation, and then I will compare some of the advantages and disadvantages of the technology, introduce some of the key players in the industry, and finally describe some of the current open source projects being worked on. Open source, in the most basic of terms, is something that people have the ability to modify and share. This model is a decentralized software developed to encourage open collaboration between members. Open source was created with the intention that users will utilize peer production and to have multiple minds working on projects to solve more problems and defy the limitation of proprietary code. This system promotes universal access through an open source or free license to a product's design or blueprint. Gaining hold with the rise of the internet, open source typically refers to a computer program that source code is available for the public to modify and edit these pre-existing programs. As mentioned before, the intention is a collaborative effort that promotes the ability to improve and share changes with the community. The code is usually released under the terms of a software license, and depending on the terms of that specific license, others are able to download, edit, modify, and change the original to then be shared back with the public. I think it's very important to understand where the open source movement came from and how it has influenced our world today. So, in order to do that, I will share a brief history of open source. In the late 70s and early 80s, manufacturers began to increase the use of copyrights on their technologies, withholding source code. Proprietary software began to take over the world of technology. As collaboration dwindled, Richard Stallman, a member of MIT's Artificial Intelligence Lab in 1971, knew something needed to change. In 1984, Stallman created the GNU project, which would create a free operating system. This project eventually joined with Linux and had the largest installed base of all general-purpose operating systems. In 1997, Eric Raymond, a free software advocate, wrote an essay comparing the GNU and Linux projects. A year later, in 1998, Netscape decided to open source the code for Netscape Communicator. The open sourcing of this code prompted the development of another completely free and open source browser 5 years later, Mozilla Firefox. Raymond eventually founded the Open Source Initiative, the OSI, to grow the open source community. Over the past 20 years, open source has made an immense impact on the technological world we live in today, transitioning from outsider to mainstay. Next, I think it's essential to have a common understanding of some terms associated with open source in order to fully comprehend the system. The first term is source code. Every project has a source code, which is a text listing of commands to be compiled or assembled in an executable computer program. Usually you can't see it, alter it, or even have access to it. However, in open source, people are able to access and modify the source code of a product. Next is free distribution. Free distribution refers to the action of sharing an application after it is customized through an open source. We mentioned OSI, or the Open Source Initiative, earlier, but this initiative is essentially designed to maintain compliance and trademark information that the industry at large recognizes in a cooperative effort, or in other words, ensures all collaborators of open source play nice. The open source community is where the original programmers distribute the program to be improved and shared. Committers, on the other hand, are the community's control experts. They actually decide what changes based on community's experience and what they think will be best for the users. Users can still modify programs on their own. However, these changes aren't always accepted into the originally licensed version. Cloud computing is another term worth visiting. It is a model for enabling convenient, on demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources. For example, networks, servers, storage, applications, and services. Cloud computing relates to open source because many cloud applications are open source programs. Um, in order to fully understand what open source is, I think it's fundamental to define what a proprietary source is. Essentially, a proprietary source is the opposite of an open source. For this reason, these softwares are often compared to one another. Proprietary softwares are owned by an individual or company who retain intellectual property rights for the system. Therefore, major restrictions on its use are always present. Its source code is typically kept secret and not modifiable, and access to these systems are usually not free. I'd like to now bring attention to some of the advantages and disadvantages of using open source software. To begin, some of the major advantages using these technologies is that it is generally free. It has been estimated that open source softwares can collectively save businesses $60 billion a year. These softwares are constantly evolving, which means it typically has better quality, is more secure, and less prone to bugs than proprietary systems. In using this software, you are not tied down to using a specific vendor system that only work with their other operating systems. And finally, adaptation and modification is possible, something not found with proprietary systems. With advantages also comes some disadvantages. One of the downfalls of this system is that there is no requirement to create commercial products that will generate revenue. Because of this, open source tends to evolve with the generator's wishes instead of keeping in mind user needs. Also, because of this, sometimes open source programs aren't entirely user friendly because they're geared more towards the developers and everyday people. Another drawback is that there is less support for when things go wrong. In the sense, there's a strong reliance on the community of users to respond and fix problems. Even though open source is most often free, there are still some costs involved, such as paying for external support. Another disadvantage occurs with malicious users. Even though having an open operating system means there are a lot of people who can help identify bugs and fix them, there will always be people who have negative intentions and are willing to exploit any vulnerabilities with the programs. Last point here is that it's relatively difficult to design a commercially sound business model around the open source paradigm. So we discussed Linux in our class lecture a few weeks ago about open source, so I thought it would be worthwhile to investigate the application further. Linux is a family of free and open source software operating systems built around the Linux kernel. This program has the largest installed base of all general purpose operating systems, and therefore is one of the most prominent examples of free open source software open for collaboration today. Some of the most popular and mainstream distributors Linux work with are Arch Linux, CentOS, Debian, Raspbian, Fedora, Gentoo, Linux Mint, Magella, OpenSUSE, and Ubuntu. Linux has also achieved great success in the mobile device market. This company is responsible for Android, one of the most popular and widely used operating systems on smartphones, tablets, and wearables today. NASA has also elected to replace some of their incredibly expensive machinery with clusters of inexpensive commodity computers running Linux. Some commercial users who elect to use Linux are Dell, IBM, and Hewlett-Packard. They have adopted Linux support in order to avoid using Microsoft's desktop operating system market. Another software that is pertinent to discuss when learning about open source is GNU. This project was first proposed in 1983 by Richard Stallman at MIT. Stallman wrote the manifesto for GNU, stating 4 key freedom essentials he envisioned for free software users. These essentials are the freedom to run a program for any purpose, the freedom to study the mechanics of the program and modify it, freedom to redistribute copies, and finally, freedom to improve and change modified versions for public use. Similarly to other projects, GNU was designed to give users a free software that will influence mass collaboration on the internet. The GNU project was also responsible for making Linux, which, as we talked about earlier, was the first operating system that was free software. Next, I'm going to explain a few current open source projects that will put open source into a real-world perspective. The first up-and-coming project that is expected to exceed in 2018 is OpenCog and OpenCog Prime. This program was designed by Ben Goertzel, and the technology is designed as an architecture geared toward virtual and robot capabilities, intended to increase research on artificial general intelligence. Another goal is to achieve general intelligence matching that could surpass the human level one day. Established by the Linux Foundation that we talked about earlier, Hyperledger is essentially a toolbox for open source blockchains and other useful elements. The project was born with the hope to increase cross-industry collaboration, which is another common theme we see with the open source movement. Hyperledger draws on the innovation of distributed ledger technology. Blockchain is also believed to be a key in the development of disruption. Disruption is a technology that has the potential to transform industry in a wide range of everyday processes in the future. TensorFlow is another project that has gained a lot of momentum in the last few years. TensorFlow, created by the Google Brain team, is one of the most commonly known open source projects. TensorFlow is essentially a software library that can be adapted for programming and data flow purposes, which allows it to cover a wide range of use cases. It is also tapping into a tech trend that is recently getting a lot of momentum, which is machine learning. I know it was created by the Google Brain team, but Google is still a major advocate of this project. Our last real-world application is Vault. So with security being a pertinent issue in the open source sphere, the Vault project has aimed its efforts on increasing encryption of data while in transit, with the hopes to further general secure management of information. The system provides secure storage by encrypting the data before it's even written. Also, in the case of an actual intrusion, Vault can lock down the systems, which adds another invaluable layer of security. In conclusion, defining what open source actually is, sharing a bit of its history, sharing some pertinent terms, comparing benefits and detriments of the system, bringing attention to a few current options or a few current open source projects. It is apparent this technology has the potential to increase online collaboration and bring minds together to solve problems that affect our society every day. Thank you.